This tutorial comes from Ian Sherman, who's a mixer engineer for the likes of Primal Scream, the Freemasons, and the Stereophonics. He's currently working on forthcoming albums from The Root and also My Bloody Valentine. Ian is also a tutor here at Point Blank, and this is a sample taken from the online Art of Mixing course.
In this video, we're going to take a look at setting up an algorithmic digital reverb. Now, we're going to use PlatinumVerb as an example, and as we kind of said, it's not the greatest sounding reverb in the world, but it's got all the parameters, so it's a really useful one to practice on. So we're going to use the tempo track as our example, and I'm just going to play around this for a sec. Right, so I'm just going to stop us there because it's this, it's that lead stab sound that I want to use as our example. And I'm just going to find it down here and just solo it for you guys, and also turn it up so we can hear it a little bit more clearly. And let's just extend this out. And so it's this sound. And what I'd like to do with a reverb, I'd like to create something that's just going to add a little bit of tail to that and a little bit of kind of flutter. So I'm going to grab a PlatinumVerb and insert it on a bus. So I've got my bus going to my auxiliary, come down, insert my PlatinumVerb onto my aux return, and just dial in a bit of level. Now we've looked at the parameters for this, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at both the early reflection and the reverb components of this sound. So for the moment, I'm just going to demonstrate on the early reflection so we can really hear those clearly. What we can do is just play this and see what we get straight off the box. Now if I just mute this, so you can hear, that's just a very subtle reflection. We're only really just hearing one of them at the moment. And what we can do is we can extend the time that it takes to hear this, and that's our pre-delay. Now that's one of the most important parameters on any reverb really. And if we just make this quite extreme, excuse the glitches, so you can hear it really quite clearly. We're kind of really separated it from the original sound. Now usually the pre-delay that you're going to be wanting is going to be something around 10 milliseconds, maybe up to 50, maybe more if you're going for special effects. What I quite like to do is actually set it in time with the tempo of the track. I just find that it works for me. So what I'm going to do is get up a calculator. And there's a simple calculation you can do to determine how many milliseconds are per beat at any tempo. And it's this. So you take 60,000, which is milliseconds per minute, divide it by the tempo, which is 130 in this case, and it gives us 461. So there's 461 milliseconds per beat at 130 BPM. So if we divide that by 4, it gives us a 16th. So we know that 115 milliseconds is a 16th at 130 BPM. And what I like to do is divide it by 4 again to get into kind of pre-delay numbers. So we could say that 14 would be a good number for pre-delay, 28 would be, times it by 2 is 56, or thereabouts. I think there's a bit of rounding up there. Let's see, so 57.5. And I just find this generally works quite naturally in the track. So if we look at 28, there or thereabouts. And we haven't got a lot of tempo reference, but even so, you can kind of tell it feels comfortable with the sound. If we get a kick going, maybe. What do you say? 115 would be a 16th. So you can hear there's a kind of tempo reference there. But I even find right down in the lower reaches of the numbers that the reflection feels most comfortable when it's actually in time with the track. So it's just a little tip for you. What we can do, our next parameters, we've got room size and room shape, and these two kind of work together. And if I bring up the room size, you'll hear what happens is we get more reflections. So the bigger the room size, the more reflections that you're going to get. And I quite like what it does to this sound. I quite like that little flutter. Now if I change the room shape, it's going to change the pattern of those reflections. I quite like the triangular where you get a lot of reflection. And maybe just a little bit less level there. I think that's kind of the flutter that I was after. Just a little bit of movement. Okay, so I'm going to live with that for a second. Stereo bass, very simple. If you imagine two kind of virtual microphones, stereo bass is the spacing between them. So what we've said is 0.2 is going to be the equivalent of kind of standing in the room if you think about how wide your head is. So it's going to sound a little bit more natural. Obviously, if you want to widen out the reflections, it's not a problem. It's just going to make them wider. For our purposes, I'm going to start pretty narrow. And that's really our early reflection setup. So let's bring the balance over and start hearing a bit of reverb. Now we look at our first parameter here, initial delay. So it's a little bit like the pre-delay here, but it's the amount of time between the original sound source and the kind of onset of the kind of diffused reverb portion of the sound. And generally you're going to want this longer than the actual pre-delay, because if you think about it, you need to hear the reflections before that tail comes in. Of course you can have the reverb starting immediately, but it's going to sound a little bit more natural if it's a little bit longer. I mean, again, you could start using those musical increments again. So there's kind of a stagger to them. I quite like what happens if we come up to around 1/16, so a 1/16. I love that little pause that happens. So I'm going to stick with that because it feels quite natural, and I think it's going to work well with the rhythm track. Just adds a little bit of bounce to it, really. Next one, again, we've just got a simple stereo spread, which you guys are familiar with. We can make it wider. Tends to make it very thin when we go wide, but we could also make it mono, which, especially for rhythmic percussive sounds, creates really interesting effects. Now the next one, the crossover, and this crossover, low ratio, low frequency level are all kind of related. And really what we said, if I go through it very briefly, is what happens with the reverb portion of the sound. It gets split into two bands, and this is because generally in kind of reality, high frequencies are absorbed much more easily and therefore quickly than low frequencies. So what happens naturally with reverb is the high frequency portion of the sound tends to not last as long, it doesn't extend as long as the actual low frequency portion of the sound. Therefore, in other words, as you get to the end of the reverb tail, the sound just gets duller and duller. And these three parameters really kind of mimic that. Well, four if we include the high cut. And I could demonstrate for you. If we use the low ratio now, the low ratio down below 100% essentially means that the low portion of the sound is going to last for less time than the high portion. If we go above 100%, it's the other way around. So if we just push this right up and also push up our low frequency level, and that's just a level control for the low frequency portion, you can see and hear the low frequencies just carry on much longer than the high frequencies. If we bring that down, you know, there's not a lot of high frequency content in this sound, but nonetheless you get the idea. Now the crossover is the point that you split those two bands. So if we move this down to 100 Hz, it basically means that only frequencies below 100 Hz are going to be extended in relation to the low ratio. And if you've got your kind of big speakers out, you'll be able to hear that. If we go all the way up to 1000 Hz, it means that all the frequencies below 1000 Hz are going to be extended as per the low ratio. And you kind of hear that there's more frequency content in that. Now I quite like the effect of just having that little kind of sub rumble You know, it's really good for sound design. This, in a way, you're shaping the character of the way that the reverb evolves. Let's bring that level down a bit. Yeah, I kind of like that. Something like that. Now the high cut is just a high cut on the actual high portion of the sound, and there's not much high frequency content, so we won't hear it. But as you guys know about filters, you won't have a problem getting your head around this. Density, as we discussed, it's how densely packed in the actual reflections in the reverb portion of the sound are. The thousands and thousands of reflections you've got there. So a high density is going to give you a smoother sounding reverb. As we come down to the bottom, we're going to start hearing those reflections as distinct echoes in a way. You know, still a lot of them, but you can hear them because they're not so densely packed in. So I'm going to go somewhere in between here because I quite like the graininess of it. I mean, obviously that's too grainy. But I think we want this to be a little bit lo-fi. If we wanted it more grainy, we could reduce the diffusion. And this is kind of messing with the pattern of the reflections, the timing, and the spacing, the panorama, the levels as well. And again, it's just going to make it more grainy. And again, kind of smoother and less distinct up at the top. So I quite like that. Again, I kind of like this lo-fi idea on this sound. Should try all the way down. Lastly, we just got our reverb time, so we can bring this up. Obviously, make the reverb much longer, or bring it down. Make it much shorter. I think around 3 seconds was good for this sound. I got kind of used to that. So that's it. Let's hear it in context of the track. Let's just find our loop. And hopefully this will just help it sit in a little bit. I just need to bring the level down a little bit. And yeah, I like that. I like that little tail we've got in there. I feel like I can have it a bit louder now. I think we were down at 11 before. Yeah, definitely. It's nice, just very subtle bit of ambience kind of tailing off there. It's like shimmer, which is exactly what I want. So you can see, you know, PlatinumVerb, something like that, it does sound all right. You can, you know, in terms of sound design, you can get some kind of interesting stuff. It's just not very natural sounding. I think that's kind of my point with it. But very controllable, very editable. You know, you can really kind of sculpt it to sound the way you want it to.